Being recorded. There it goes. All right. Good morning, everybody. This is the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. This is day 2 of our weekly Wednesday meeting. It is October 20th, 2022, and we will acknowledge our existence with a roll call.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Ackerman.
Here.
Commissioner Bowe, Commissioner Cross.
Present.
Commissioner McGowan.
Here.
Commissioner Mesner.
Here.
Commissioner Oath.
Here.
Commissioner Robbins.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 6 out of 7 commissioners present.
Great. It's great to see everybody again. Welcome to a beautiful Thursday morning in the fall of October in Colorado. Hopefully we'll get through this meeting. We can all get outside and enjoy the outdoors for a bit. But before we do that, we have quite a bit on our plate. A couple of procedural matters before we move into the docket that is before us. First, I just want to acknowledge that our SB 19-181 rules provide for much more expansive stakeholder participation. We're seeing that in the docket that we have before us, in which we've got the first docket in which we've had folks, relevant local government or approximate local governments that have petitioned to be a party to this, and we're holding a full-blown hearing, and that's the way it should be. I also would like to sort of friendly remind everybody that, on our OGDP applications, we allow for and encourage participation by neighbors, as well as others that are perhaps not neighbors, but that are outside of 2,000 feet or inside of 2,000 feet. We hear from them all, and we encourage all of that participation at all times. So make sure that you and your friends are aware of the fact that the commission, you need to sign up ahead of time. But if you sign up, we're going to hear from you, irrespective of where the distance you may be from the actual location. So that's sort of procedural matter number 1. Procedural matter number 2, I'd like to call upon Commissioner Oath to provide some perspective on the CDPHE consult process. I may have made some incorrect assumptions in terms of how that works and how that doesn't work. And so I think it would be really helpful for the record for all of us to understand a little better the CDPHE consult process and how that works. Commissioner Oath, you were recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity. I did want to just share and spend a little bit of time on this, given that there were some comments yesterday, specifically around like the 38 air BMPs, and it was kind of referred to as CDPHE having recommended all 38, and why the operator did it or not, agree to some of those. But I wanted to clarify that a little bit. The list that we have that includes those 38 BMPs for air, that's a list of all potential BMPs. And then what we do in the consultation process to streamline it is we ask the operator to well, first we have kind of an initial conversation with them where we talk about this and then ask them to fill out that list before we enter into a consultation meeting with them. And we understand that some of those BMPs may not be applicable in all of the cases based on site-specific factors and considerations, right? And some of those are, and some of those aren't at issue here in this case. So, for example, in this case, the operator agreed to use electric drilling rig engines, right? So, therefore, the BMP of using like the Tier 4 engines for drilling is not applicable in this proposal. Conversely, operator did not commit to the electrification BMP for hydraulic fracturing, but they committed to the BMP of using Tier 4 engines for hydraulic fracturing. Maybe another example is there's the BMP of timing activities associated with high emissions in order to reduce the potential for exposure. For example, like if development is occurring near a high occupancy building unit or a school, that's not applicable if a school or a high occupancy building unit is not located nearby, right? So, again, the list includes 38 air BMPs, 13 water BMPs, 2 waste, and 6 PFAS for 59 total. And those, are developed to look at what can and should be done to mitigate and protect public health and environmental resources. In this case, the operator agreed to 35 of our BMPs. And we noted each of those that the operator agreed to in our consultation summary letter to COGCC, which is part of this record and was reviewed by the director in her recommendation and by others as well. And in this case, I think I want to make it clear that we are comfortable that the BMPs that the operator has committed to adequately minimize the risks and are appropriate.
Thank you, Commissioner Oath, for clarifying the process. I, for one, think that is a good process in terms of allowing, having that discussion and then, having the operator look at the list and make determinations of, what works, what doesn't work, what's practicable and what's not practicable, and then moving in that direction. So thank you again for that clarification. With that clarification, I believe we had a third procedural matter that we needed to take up kind of early on, and that had to do with a clarification on the director's recommendation. But Ms. Larson, I'm not sure if we have Ms. Trask or Director Murphy with us just yet this morning. Could you let me know?
We are bringing Ms. Trask in right now.
And while we're doing that, why don't we go ahead and bring in the lawyers so that we'll be able to seamlessly move into the next step of this morning's agenda. All right, let me frame this. We are taking up docket number 2107-00115. It is the Crestone Peak Resources COGCC OGDP, and I now would recognize Ms. Trask for whatever form of clarification she'd like to make with regard to the director's rec.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, commissioners. Good morning, everybody. I'm Sabrina Trask. I'm the Planning and Permitting Manager with COGCC. I just would like to take this quick opportunity to address a little bit of a confusion arising from staff's published director's recommendation for the Crestone COGCC East OGDP. On page 7 of the revised recommendation, under the discussion of alternative location number 1, there is a reference to the City and County of Broomfield's moratorium prohibiting any new oil and gas permitting. This reference was included in Crestone's alternative location analysis, and staff included this information in the director's recommendation as part of Crestone's reasoning for not using this alternative location. Staff appreciates Broomfield for flagging for us that this moratorium is no longer in effect as of approximately May of 2021. Regardless, alternative location number 1 is within 1/2 mile of an active bald eagle nest. And it also has more residential building units than the proposed COGCC East location. So even without a moratorium, COGCC staff does not feel alternative location number 1 is a better location than the proposed COGCC East location. So thank you for letting me clarify that.
Thank you so much. And I no fault aligned there. This COGCC is one of the earlier OGDPs. It's been in the hopper or the process for a long period of time. I appreciate that at this point, we're doing everything we can to make sure that we've got a full-on accurate record. And so thank you very much for that clarification, Ms. Trask.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Any questions from commissioners? Okay, seeing none, Ms. Jost, Ms. Paranos, Mr. Sullivan, already see you. Great. Let's get everybody before us. Good morning. Isn't it so much easier to practice law via Zoom as opposed to being in a hearing room or in a court? Okay, so with that aside, I had teed up the idea of having a joint discussion this morning about the sort of this request from Erie for the wholesale edition of all the Erie operator agreement BMPs being attached to our Form 2A. And I had some concerns about duplication, different enforcement, et cetera. I think Commissioner Messner, you joined in that addressing an area of concern. I don't know if that I need to have this thing resolved, and the commissioners can certainly do what we're going to do, but I did think about giving you guys an ability to think about it overnight. And does anybody want to, address this issue before we move back into kind of the main thing? And as I'm talking about that, Ms. Larson, if Mr. Maxey's with us as well, I think he's a pertinent person to bring to the table as well. Ms. Jost, I'll first turn to you, and knowing full well that your position is probably like, we'll do it if we need to do it, but we also don't have to do it. But did you want to bring anything more to the table?
Yes, Chair, thank you. And I am happy to. We put together what we hope to be as an explanation kind of illustrative slide. That being said, if Mr. Maxey wants to proceed before me, because Weld is the relevant local government, I'm happy to do that, or I can pull up the slide and maybe try to have just a minute or two conversation about it.
What since you did that homework, why don't we see your slide, and then Mr. Maxey can look at it as well.
Okay, excellent. Give me 1 second, Chair. Okay, can everyone see that slide?
Yes.
Okay, so what we really chatted about last night was really confirming Chair and Mr. Maxey's comments on basically statutory authority versus contractual authority. And what this slide is attempting to illustrate is that with respect to the permits that cover the Coslet East location, by statute, the commission is the governing state agency, as we all know, and that for purposes of enforceability, the state has the ability to enforce its own rules and regulations. That's the green arrow down to the COGCC, and we've cited the statutory references. For purposes of the statute as well, with respect to Weld County, the statute of 2920-104-1G states that each local government within its respective jurisdiction has the authority to plan for and regulate the use of land. So that takes us back to Weld County's permit as the relevant local government governing the Coslet East location. Because as you can see, the reason I used, and this is from your COGCC map, the COGCC map, we have a convergence of Erie, we have a convergence of Broomfield, and then we have Weld as well. The Coslet sits squarely within Weld's jurisdiction. And then for purposes of Erie, it is a contractual arrangement, a private contract. And so Erie cannot enforce Weld or the commission's BMPs, whereas the commission and Weld cannot enforce Erie's BMPs. Even though there is a contractual relation between Crestone and Erie, that is again a private contract. That's not statutory. So the purpose of this illustration, we hoped, was just a simple overview of how Crestone views the authority of the Coslet location with respect to Weld being the relevant local government, commission being the state agency who governs, and Erie can't usurp the authority of either by virtue of its contractual arrangement.
Great, thank you for that. And so just to make sure we got the record completely clear, the yellow is municipal, incorporated municipal territory, whether it be Erie to the north or Broomfield to the south, and the non-yellow sort of just general topography is unincorporated Weld.
That is correct, Chair.
Okay. With that, I'm gonna, in no particular order, call upon Mr. Maxey for his thoughts, and then Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you, Chair Robbins, and good morning again, Commissioners. Thank you for a few minutes to talk about this very important issue, and thank you to Ms. Jost for just showing a good visual. I think a picture is worth 1,000 words, and it's easy to kind of follow along with some of the thought process when you can see a picture like that. Chair Robbins, you said something that I think is worthy to repeat at the opening of the meeting. You talked about how Senate Bill 181 provided for an expansion of involvement, and I could not agree more. And I want to reiterate the fact that Weld County's process has always, since the opening of our department, since the beginning of our 1041 WOGLA process, has always provided for that expansion of involvement within the Weld County process as well. Whether that be from surrounding property owners, whether that be from the surface owner, whether that be from other jurisdictions that may have interest in a land use case that is before Weld County, the 1041 WOGLA process has accounted for that and has allowed for that since day one, which is not much different than other land use cases that our planning department considers. They encourage involvement as well from surrounding property owners, from surrounding homeowners, from surrounding jurisdictions when there's other land use cases, whether that be a manufacturing facility or a dairy or a solar facility. We encourage public interaction. And I just wanted to repeat that phrase or that comment that you said at the beginning and say that we do agree with that. And in this case here, I want to reiterate the fact that the appropriate parties were involved. They were notified, they were given ample opportunity to comment, and not only just to comment, but to actually participate in Weld County's hearing process before the hearing officer. And in this case, that did not happen. We did not receive any comments from any local jurisdictions, contrary to what you're hearing and what you're discussing today. So I just wanted to make sure that that was, again, on record. Regarding some of the things that I've thought about over last night and in listening to what I was able to listen to from the hearing yesterday, you know, I don't think that you all take land use authority lightly, but I just want to say that I hope that nobody here takes it lightly, whether it's the city and county of Broomfield and their jurisdictional responsibilities or the town of Erie, but Weld County certainly doesn't take it lightly. Weld County has a valid 1041 permit. We are the jurisdiction with land use authority for this area. The operator agreement, as Ms. Joe said, is a private agreement between Erie and Crestone. On a personal note, quite frankly, I'm not sure how this location is included in that agreement when Erie doesn't have any land use authority over this particular parcel. But I'm not an attorney. I don't have the agreement. I still haven't seen it, and I don't expect to see it because that's nothing that Weld County wants to get in the middle of. We do not want to get in the middle of private negotiations, whether it's landowners or companies and other entities. We don't get in the middle of those things. But we are concerned about anything contained in the operator agreement, which may give the impression that Erie has any ability to inspect or regulate this location. The BMPs that are contained within the operator agreement, in Weld County's opinion, should not be placed on the 2A, as it would cause more confusion than what it's worth as far as regulatory jurisdiction. That being said, I do want to say that Weld County is more than willing to continue to work with any jurisdiction that believes that they have any type of conflicts or any type of concerns about a location. And probably on this one, the best one that I could bring up right now would be traffic related items. We acknowledge that the town of Erie has annexed a large portion, if not all, of the roadways in and around this development. You all know that Weld County takes a hard look at traffic. That is a local jurisdictional item. We would want to work with the town of Erie to make sure that their traffic concerns are alleviated, that we can partner with them to make sure that there's nothing that goes awry regarding traffic and that it's going in the direction it needs to go. We will continue to do that, but as a whole, as far as BMPs or enforcement ability, we believe that that needs to stay with the relevant local jurisdiction. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Maxey, for the thoughts from Weld County as the relevant local government. And, you know, I just want to encourage everybody that this sort of overlapping of authority or duplication of authority, relevant, proximate local governments, you know, I as a commissioner on my part, and I think all of our commissioners, you know, we want to, you know, do the right thing and recognize, and Mr. Maxey, I think you realize this, we're, you know, doubling down and recognizing local authority and trying to sync up how we're doing the things we're supposed to do with how Weld County is doing the things it's supposed to do. In this instance, we obviously have a bunch of proximate local governments, obviously, and so I'll stop rambling at that point. Mr. Sullivan, did you want to weigh in on behalf of your client and their request to the commission?
Yes, thank you, Chairman Robbins. There is a BMP that I think the commission should be aware of that addresses this situation in the operator agreement, and it's BMP number 31. And if I can share the screen or have someone at COGCC do it, but let me see here if I can find that one.
Yeah, Ms. Larson, does Mr. Sullivan have screen sharing capability?
The panels do have screen sharing capability. There should be on the bottom bar of your Zoom screen, a little button that says share screen.
Right. Yeah, I see that. It's just, I'm not, I apologize. I can't seem to find the file that I have open.
Take your time.
Yeah, let me just, I'll go ahead and just read this into the record because it addresses conflict with COGCC requirements. And it says if the COGCC imposes any terms or conditions on Crestone's operations that are subject to this agreement that conflict with these BMPs, the more stringent requirement will apply. If a BMP is satisfied through compliance with COGCC regulations, then the COGCC has the sole authority to determine whether a violation of COGCC requirements has occurred. And such determination by COGCC will conclusively establish Crestone's compliance with the corresponding BMPs. If the COGCC determines that the COGCC requirements have been violated, then the COGCC's resolution of such violation will constitute all enforcement due with respect to the corresponding BMPs under this agreement. And again, this is on page A35 of Erie's Exhibit A. You know, with all due respect to Mr. Maxey's view, Erie does have enforcement authority under this agreement for matters that would deal with land use. And again, Crestone and Erie have stipulated that these BMPs shall apply. And so Erie did not think it particularly controversial under these circumstances to incorporate the BMPs into the COGCC's final approval of this oil and gas development plan, if that's what the COGCC decides, because of BMP 31 that recognized sort of the primacy, if you will, of the COGCC's regulations. Erie's, there are BMPs in this agreement that are more stringent than what the COGCC or CDPHE have, and they would consist of, the subject areas have to do with air quality, chemical storage and disclosure, noise mitigation, use of quiet technology, discharge valves, site disturbance, use of roads, visual buffering, and removal of equipment within 30 days from the site, training, drive-by inspections, and a provision that says no class 2 underground injection wells will be included within the operator agreement area. And so, and to answer Mr. Maxey's question, the reason that the operator agreement allows for what we would call extraterritorial jurisdiction is because the operator agreement area exceeded Erie's boundaries in 2018, and in this case still does. And so that's how that occurred. And that was just part of the negotiations between Crestone and Erie in 2018. And obviously at that time, we weren't really sure. The only thing that was really on the ballot at that time was the 2,500 foot setback. So that's the background I could give. And if there are more specific questions, we can try to answer them. I believe Dresden Kinnaird has looked at specific BMPs and can answer questions about them, but that's, and Erie would ask that they get incorporated into the COGCC's approval to the extent they're more stringent.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. I appreciate that testimony with regard to this issue. Commissioners, I had raised this morning because Erie's not presenting kind of a case, and so it seemed to me that the discussion around this needed to take place as part of Creston's sort of case in chief. I'm satisfied. I've heard from all the parties with regard to their perspectives on this. At this point, I would suggest we sort of table the issue and or move forward with the rest of the presentations, and then we can in deliberations deliberate on this issue as we deliberate on all issues. Having said that, does any commissioner have any questions of any of the panelists with regard to this matter before we move on to the Broomfield case in chief? Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. While I appreciate that Erie is not providing a case, I do think this is an incredibly important discussion on how proximate local governments interact with our hearing process. And as a former local government official, I do have some concerns about a proximate local government trying to exert jurisdictional authority over land use outside of its boundaries without an MOU in place with the other proximate local government. Having said that, if Erie is interested in having specific BMPs different than the ones that are proposed in the 2A that they feel don't satisfy elements within their operator agreement, then I would like to see specificity onto what those are and actually do a cross-reference as to what they may be proposing incorporating, rather than asking us to just incorporate the entire document, which I feel probably is not appropriate. It may be considered by this commission should there be specific asks on specific topics and clearly proposed BMPs that are different than the ones that are being proposed in the 2As, but I'm not seeing that at this point. And so I'll throw that out there.
I think that is a good and fair, prudent summary and request. Mr. Sullivan, I think we're going to give you time as the rest of the cases proceed today to potentially, spend a little time diving a little more detailed into what BMPs are already on there, absent the ones from Erie, and then particularize those that you feel would add value and protection from your client's perspective. Is that fair, John?
Yes. Yes, we can do that. Our witness, Dresden Kinnaird, has prepared like an Excel spreadsheet that basically highlights, I think, to the degree of specificity that Commissioner Messner is looking for. And I don't know if I should share that thing right now or simply send it on to Mimi Larson or something. It's not an exhibit that we identified in Erie's exhibits, but it is useful for the purpose that you've identified.
Yeah, let's call it a demonstrative exhibit. Therefore, we're not, running afoul of pre-hearing orders and things of that sort. If you could send it to each of the attorneys as well as to Ms. Larson, and then if I could have everybody pledge to take a look at it at some point during a break, and then we will call this issue back up for consideration after all the cases in chief are over. And then we can, kind of make that game day audible about how to address this issue. I think that would be an appropriate use of time and effort on everybody's part. Is that acceptable to folks? Raise your hand if it's not acceptable. All right, seeing no hands raised. Commissioner Cross, did you have a comment or question? You're muted.
Thought I clicked it, but I guess it didn't. I apologize. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Ms. Jost and Mr. Sullivan for the information today. And I just wanted to ask a quick question, Mr. Sullivan. I'll start off saying that 100% think that you have enforcement capabilities with respect to a contractual right. And I guess my question is, if the COGCC was not to include any of these BMPs, what methodology would you or process would you use to ensure that the applicant is following the BMPs, kind of going to touching on Mr. Maxey's point? What process would you use to kind of inspect to make sure that the more stringent BMPs, which are going to apply contractually regardless, are being followed?
Well, Commissioner Cross, obviously we just follow the language in the operator agreement, which is, and before I forget, this is a rather unique situation. I'm not aware of another situation that's quite like this, where an operator agreement, the operator and the town agree to extraterritorial authority over a well pad site. But David Frank would be the most likely person to say, do something like an inspection. And if a violation was disclosed, it would be addressed with Crestone and with the COGCC and or CDPHE. The town of Erie's inspection program is much more robust than it was in 2018. And again, as I said yesterday, Crestone has given every indication that they're going to comply with these BMPs based on information submitted so far. And so we're not, Erie is not presently looking at a worst case scenario, but is simply trying to make sure that its residents, the health, safety, and welfare of its residents are protected to the maximum extent it can via this agreement. And I guess if there are, when I send in the chart that shows which BMPs Erie believes are more stringent, we could discuss something with respect to a particular BMP. Does that answer your question?
I think it does, yes. I just am trying to confirm for the record that you will still plan on having inspections, or Erie will still plan on having inspections if COGCC was not to include the BMPs on it.
Oh yes, Erie would have inspections if it were alerted to something, just as it has done in the past with well pad sites in the town. Erie has done inspections at those well pad sites, but it's also alerted the CDPHE about things that it's getting reports on from its residents and the COGCC. So Erie would view this as a collaborative effort when and if there ever is a problem with a BMP violation.
Thank you.
McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I'm just trying to make sure that I'm understanding the logistics of what this would look like if the BMPs are included or not included in the 2A. So I think what I'm hearing is, regardless of whether the BMPs from Erie would be included in the 2A, Erie has the authority to go inspect through the operator agreement with Crestone?
Yes.
And so if it's, I'm just trying to figure out what this looks like for Crestone and for the other entities who are involved. Potentially we have Weld, Erie, CDPHE, and COGCC all inspecting. And then what happens if we have I guess, a disagreement about whether a BMP is being met, and or Weld County is going to inspect to its BMPs. We inspect to are we all inspecting to the 2A BMPs then? Is everybody committed to those and required to inspect to those? Or does Weld County still just inspect it with an eye towards a lens towards its BMPs, Erie with a lens towards its, and we to our 2A? Sorry, this is feeling a little complicated. I'm just trying to figure out jurisdictionally how this then all plays out and how it intertwines. And maybe this is what we'll discuss later. I don't know, Mr. Chair, but I just would like to have that discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I can take a shot at that. So Commissioner McGowan, as things are now, it would be each entity would be inspecting for compliance with their BMPs. COGCC would be going out inspecting and enforcing under the 2A, Weld County under their WOGLA permit, and Erie would be limited to enforcing the BMPs on their operator agreement. So there wouldn't be that overlap. It could get a bit more complicated if the commission were to adopt the Erie BMPs as part of the 2A, because then both the COGCC and Erie would be inspecting for and enforcing those same BMPs. Does that make sense?
It does. And so I guess I would ask our folks to also contemplate, is there a way to reflect somehow in our deliberations that we want the operator agreement honored and that Crestone has agreed to it without putting it in our 2A? If that might be an avenue for us. I'm not saying that that's what we're going to do, but what might that look like? Just wanting to make sure that it doesn't, our wires don't get all crossed and we have.
Yeah, and let's let from my perspective, let's let Mr. Sullivan do his additional crosswalk here and take this up toward the end. But you know, one avenue for us is to make a finding of fact with regard to the commitment from Crestone that the BMPs are going to be applicable through the operator agreement. And then Erie has that sort of nugget in their back pocket in terms of enforcement under the contractual arrangement. But again, I, for one, would like to sort of table this just for a bit and then get back to it after we've heard the remaining cases in chief. And then this could be part of our deliberation.
Mr. Chair, I think Mr. Maxey had his hand up.
Mr. Maxey?
Thank you, commissioners. Thank you, Commissioner McGowan and Commissioner Robbins. I was going to be okay if you did not recognize me, just for the record. I understand wanting to move along. I understand the complexity of this issue. Believe me, I know it's not easy, and I'm sure it's not easy for Crestone and for their representatives when they're trying to muddle through multiple jurisdictional requirements. I just, again, acknowledging how tricky this is. Just again, for the record, I completely agree with Commissioner McGowan and what she said, and Commissioner Messner earlier on about outside of jurisdictional boundaries and the ability to enforce rules on a land use permit that you have no land use permit for. Again, it's a huge concern, and I just want to point out one that I heard Mr. Sullivan say. Maybe that's visual, maybe that's lighting items, but those are land use items that are included both potentially within the COGCC permit, as well as the Weld County WOGLA permit. And if there's some sort of BMP, which again, I haven't seen any of these, but if there is some sort of BMP, which is more strict that you all are entertaining to put on the 2A, that would be outside of what Weld County's permit says, or potentially be in conflict with it, we would have a major issue with that. And it would put the operator in a major tight spot at that point. So I just wanted to reiterate that. I'm not going to be able to be on the meeting after 10 o'clock due to other commitments for the day, but you know, I'll watch the recording. If there's any questions, please reach out to me via email and I'd be happy to try to answer them. But again, I respect the tough position everybody's in right now. It's just something I think we need to work together on, but this multi-inspection, multi-jurisdictional is a brand new thing, and it's hard to muddle through. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Max. Thanks for letting us know your availability, non-availability. That's helpful. We do know how to get a hold of you if we need to. Anything further on this issue at this point? All right, seeing none, we will return to our regularly televised program. And I believe that we are at that point in which we are to receive the presentation in chief by Broomfield. Commissioner, or I'm sorry, Attorney Jost. It's already a long morning.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sorry to interrupt here, but Ms. Pranos and I had one item we wanted to address with you before Broomfield started their case in chief. And Ms. Pranos, this is about the exhibits you had asked about yesterday. Ms. Pranos and I had a good conversation last night. We did walk through the exhibits with respect to her question on the CTEH study that Dr. McMullen had referenced as part of her direct testimony. We did acknowledge that it was inadvertently left off the materials list, but that study is publicly available. And we also acknowledge that Broomfield has not had an opportunity to review it unless Ms. Pranos, you tell me anything different over the last 12 hours. But we just wanted to put that on the record, Chair, that we have discussed that, feel like we've resolved Ms. Pranos's concerns and wanted to put that on the record before Broomfield spoke.
Great.
Thank
Ms.
you.
Pranos?
Thank you so much, Chairman Robbins, and thank you, Ms. Jost. That is correct, and I really do appreciate Ms. Jost's attention to this matter and conversation that we had last night. It was very helpful. So just to elaborate a bit, Dr. McMullen in her slide 40 of her presentation yesterday referred to a number of different studies, including CTEH studies, and then showed a map that identified some CTEH studies that had been done at some of the extraction well sites in Broomfield. It was that information in particular that was new to us. We did attempt to find those studies and click the links that were attached in a filing, that supplemental filing that Crestone provided on October 6th, but those links actually don't work. And so we were not able to look at those studies last night. So I would just, as Ms. Jo said, we were unable to dig into any of those studies, even though they may be publicly available, and definitely just wanted to make sure that the commission is aware of that.
Very good. Any commissioners with questions on that point? All right. Commissioner Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just wonder if Ms. Joseph, perhaps you can get Dr. McMullen to try and locate a copy of those to send to everyone. At this point in time, perhaps not part of the record. I'll let Chair Robbins make that determination, but I think if we could see that, that would be helpful.
Thank you, Commissioner. We can work on that.
Okay. I should have asked this question ahead of time before I called for the case in chief. Anything further procedurally before we move into Broomfield's case in chief?
Mr. Chair, I just have one more question, if I may. Yesterday, we were left with a couple other homework assignments, one of which was to have Dr. McMullen walk through the CDPHE AIR BMPs to have her review and then potentially provide any comment. We're prepared to do that, but we're also happy to do that in our response after Broomfield presents, so we don't take anything off track. I just wanted to go ahead and put that out there, that homework has been done.
No, appreciate. And let's do that in the response. I think that's the more appropriate time. And we'll go ahead and hear from Broomfield first and then give you a chance for the response. So, Ms. Pranos, it looks like you've got a couple of panelists with you. So the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Chairman Robbins. We have three witnesses who plan to present today. Those are Andrew Valdez, who's the former Director of Strategic Initiatives at Broomfield, Mr. Brent Buck, who's the CEO of Ajax Analytics, who's conducted much of the air monitoring in Broomfield, and Dr. Megan Weisner, who is the chief epidemiologist with the City and County's Department of Public Health. We also have Mindy Olker, who will be sharing our slides. So at this point, Mindy, if you could go ahead and share the slide deck, that would be terrific. And commissioners, after we filed our slides, Ms. Jost indicated that Crestone is no longer challenging our parity status. And so we are able to save everyone some time, and we can start with slide 6. If the commissioners have any questions about the slides that go before that, which go to our request for party status and the basis for that, which of course has been granted by the hearing officer, we're more than happy to come back to those slides and answer any questions. But in the interest of time, we can go ahead and start with slide 6, Mindy.
Yeah, and I don't think we need to, go through the party status piece since that's been agreed to. We do have a quick procedural matter. I need Ms. Larson to swear in your witnesses.
Need to do so, Mr. Chair, or if you'd like AAG Mercer to do that, I can certainly do that as well. Oh, sorry, Mr. Chair, I think you're on mute.
Yeah. AAG Mercer is whom I meant to do the swearing of the witnesses. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Robbins. And Ms. Ranios, if you wouldn't mind stopping the screen share so that I can see everybody for a moment, that would be helpful.
Mindy, are you able to stop? Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll swear each of the Broomfield witnesses in one at a time. And all that I need you to do is raise your right hand, state your name, and state that you swear to tell the truth. So I'll start with Mr. Valdez.
Andrew Valdez, I swear to tell the truth.
Thank you. Dr. Weisner.
Megan Weisner, I swear to tell the truth.
Thank you. And Mr. Buck.
Brent Buck, I swear to tell the truth.
Thank you. I believe those are all of the Broomfield witnesses, and so can let you get back to your presentation.
Great. We can start the screen share on page 6 again.
All righty. Well, thank you, commissioners and staff, for your time today. So I am the former director of Broomfield's Oil and Gas Department. And as was alluded to previously, we have extensive firsthand experience at the intersection of oil and gas in populated areas. Oil and gas really became a priority for our community in 2018 when we were required essentially to accommodate a major development project that consisted of 84 wells across 6 pads and adjacent to dense residential areas. The pads are shown on the map here. Because of this proximity, this project would not be permitted today under updated setback rules. And our experience of the past 4 years, I think, is a clear demonstration of why. Despite our relatively limited resources as a small local government, we invested in the most robust oil and gas program in the state, which includes our state-of-the-art air quality monitoring network. I'll discuss some of the findings of our air quality monitoring program a little later in the presentation. However, I'd first like to draw the Commission's attention to our catalog of social impacts, which includes our complaints and response system. So every dot you see on the map here represents a unique complaint or concern, the 4 most common being air quality, odor, noise, and health. Since the inception of the program, Broomfield has received and responded to and/or investigated over 1,800 concerns and complaints, 650 of which were health related. So I do want to make the distinction here that this is separate and parallel to the public health investigation that Dr. Weisner will discuss later in the presentation. Next slide. All right, so moving on to our air quality monitoring program. So Broomfield has worked with some of the most preeminent atmospheric scientists in the country to develop an air quality monitoring system that provides insights into the composition and transport of oil and gas sourced noxious plumes. Shown in blue on the map here, a combination of stationary and mobile systems were deployed both near oil and gas sources and in residential areas. This provides spatial and temporal coverage so we could accurately study short and long-term impacts to air quality. Next slide. So first, let's discuss longer interval air quality observations. We began taking weekly canister samples at numerous locations around the pads prior to pad development to determine an ambient baseline of VOCs and tracer compounds. The baselines can be seen on the left sides of the 6 graphs shown here. The Livingston pad on the right and the interchange pads on the left. We then aligned different phases of pre-production with our weekly canister data shown as the different color bands in the 6 graphs. As you can see, the increased variance and higher overall values within the pre-production data demonstrates this activity is associated with excess total VOCs, benzene, and other tracer compounds like ethane above an ambient baseline. We can also see that once sites are in full closed loop production after flowback, the data appears to return close to baseline. I believe this is significant and relevant to the cumulative impacts discussion, since we see here that air quality around oil and gas sites can be continually impacted for as long as a pad is in pre-production. And this can go on for years. And by extension, the more of these projects that are in a geographic area, the more the cumulative and additive those impacts will be. Next slide. So now let's discuss short-term air quality observations. Our real-time VOC monitoring network is paired with air canisters designed to trigger when a VOC threshold is reached. These air trigger canisters take either a 1-minute or 15-minute sample. Sticking with the cumulative impacts theme, our most active quarter from an air quality perspective was the 4th quarter of 2021, where we had 3 different pads all in different phases of pre-production. During that 3-month time frame, we collected 12 short interval canister samples that exceeded the acute exposure health guideline value of 9 parts per billion. As has been discussed, an acute exposure is defined as at least 1 hour. And we do use modeling to extrapolate 1-hour estimates for those events. Our consultant from Ajax Analytics is going to expand on this modeling methodology further. However, I do want to draw the Commission's attention to the most significant event we observed in this quarter, which occurred on December 4th at the United Pad, which was undergoing mill out of a hydraulically stimulated well. This particular event caused activation of 4 triggers in succession. The farthest was about a mile downwind from the source. While we did observe dispersion of the plume's magnitude, the further it traveled from the pad, our canister with the highest VOC concentrations resulted in a 1-hour estimate for benzene reaching 223 parts per billion, far exceeding the acute exposure limit. Furthermore, this pad remained about 60% intact as it traveled 4,000 feet from west to east over a 35-minute period. If the Commission is interested, I actually have a visual representation of the event in our rebuttal slides. So atmospheric conditions obviously play a significant role in transport and dispersion of noxious air plumes. We've even observed some plumes dissipating 98, 99%. However, that is not always the case, and we certainly aren't able to capture every event due to the very nature of how air moves across the landscape. So in the history of the program, these events appeared to occur during normal operations. In other words, nothing like went wrong when brief but intense plumes were emitted. As far as we can tell, when raw hydrocarbons are exposed to the atmosphere and aren't contained in closed loop equipment or channeled through like a catalytic converter or burned in a emissions control device, VOCs can be directly released into the atmosphere, resulting in plumes that can travel significant distances, exposing people to hazardous air pollutants. These are operations like agitation of drill cuttings and mud shakers, mill out of hydraulically stimulated wells, and emptying of sand cans during flowback. None of these are part of Crestone's emissions inventory. And with that, I'll turn over the presentation to Brent Buck from Ajax Analytics to expand on our much discussed 1-hour estimates. Brent?
Thank you, Andrew. I'm here today to share details about our methodology for scaling short-term volatile organic compound or VOC sample concentrations into 1 hour VOC concentration estimates. We'll start with a very short background and some context before moving the conversation into how we model those 1 hour estimates from 1 minute resolution data. So first, I like to frame air quality monitoring as a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, we have no knowledge whatsoever about what's in the air that we're breathing. On the other end of the spectrum, we have our ideal perfect knowledge state, where we would have Star Trek-like understanding of every compound in every cubic meter of space for every second of every day. Next slide. Air monitoring is our human attempt to move our level of knowledge from one end of the spectrum to the other. To move down this path, we use real-world measurement from various technologies, each with varying levels of certainty or accuracy. The next slide. And then we extend those measurements across time, space, and air composition with assumptions or modeling. That's statistics. The overall goal of any scientific endeavor is to maximize our measurement and minimize the assumptions to create enough confidence needed to make a decision, take an action, or communicate on a topic. Next slide, please. So a little background on the measurement inputs we use in this model. Andrew touched on them yesterday. Dr. McMullen touched on them. So I'll kind of see if I can go fast. The measurements we use in our model calculations come from sensor systems equipped with photoionization detector or PID sensors, which respond to over 900 different VOCs to output a single total volatile organic compound or TVOC indicator metric. Our sensors measure continuously and we record 15-second averages. All of our monitoring systems are equipped with a canister sampling triggering device, which automatically collects a reference quality whole air canister sample when that PID sensor detects a VOC plume crossing over our monitoring site. These canister samples are then analyzed at the Atmospheric Science Lab at Colorado State University, which provides high quality concentration measurements of 49 VOCs, including known hazardous air pollutants. This is also a good place for me to clarify the time duration of these triggered samples. In this model, and through most of our reporting to date, we've used the term 1 minute trigger samples. Recently, based on our real-time canister vacuum data, we've begun restating our data set to reflect that the triggered samples are in reality under a minute in duration, which could be important in later levels of modeling. Next slide, please. At Ajax, one of our primary scientific approach principles is that we measure and model at the highest resolution feasible. Similar to launching better space telescopes or building higher resolution electron microscopes, we believe that breakthrough knowledge comes from developing better understanding of real-world pollutants at higher time and space resolution. However, because data at these tight time and space resolutions that we record hasn't yet really made it into the academic journal ecosystem, many of our customers and stakeholders have asked us to provide context for our measurements in relationship to current federal or state health guideline values, which led us to develop this methodology for estimating 1 hour concentrations based on our sub-minute sensor resolution and canister sample data. Next slide, please. So to add some context and create a base understanding of the method, let's take a look at the simplest model that we could perform using the VOC benzene as our estimated compound. I call this the napkin math method. So we'll accept that the canister sample's reference measurement in this example was 93.38 parts per billion, because we accept one, the real-time canister vacuum data tells us that the sensor system took a good sample, and two, we believe that the CSU lab religiously performed their quality controls to provide a reliable concentration measurement. Therefore, we can say we trust the sample and the measurement that we're using in this model. For our napkin math, we'll assume that every minute in the time around our 1 minute sample had 0 benzene in the air. This allows us to do simple math, averaging 59 zeros in our 93 part per billion measurement to get a 1 hour benzene estimate of 1.56 parts per billion. Next slide, please. However, as you already noticed, the assumption that there was 0 benzene in the air for 59 minutes is a pretty long stretch for an assumption. But this napkin math method also gives us the lower boundary of a mathematically viable estimate. Anything we do with these same inputs to improve on this estimate should provide a result of at least 1.56 parts per billion. Next slide, please. So we know that we can do better than assuming 0 benzene for 59 minutes around our measured sample. To improve on this assumption, we use the PID sensors output, which we trust because this sensor identified the plume and triggered this elevated canister sample in the first place. Next slide. Which leads us to our assumptions, right? Any model has assumptions. We know from manufacturer documentation, as well as our own validating observations, that a PID sensor responds differently to different VOC cocktails or VOC compositions in the air. For this estimate, we assume that the PID was responding to 2 different air compositions during this period, one for the ambient mixture of VOCs and one composition for the plume mixture of VOCs. We also need to look at the TVOC indicator trace and identify exactly when the plume measurement started and stopped. That is, when did this plume first start crossing over our sensor, and when did the plume either stop or get blown in a different direction where this sensor couldn't see it anymore. This is also a good place to note that this method does not include assumptions about where the plume went after this sensor stopped observing it, nor do we assume how long this plume may have been zipping around the area before this emission source stopped emitting. That means any estimate we provide under this model is an estimate of the concentration at this particular monitoring system's location over an hour's time. So it's a temporal model that does not include modeling across space. Next slide, please. So now that we've identified and clarified what we do and do not assume in the model, let's take a look at the very simple middle school math that actually goes into the calculation. We use data from the monitoring network to calculate 2 ratios or conversion factors to help convert a PID sensor's output to a benzene concentration. One conversion factor helps us convert sensor output to benzene within the ambient air's conversion factor or VOC composition. And the other conversion factor converts sensor output to benzene within that plume VOC composition. So the conversion factor is calculated using the benzene concentration from the triggered canister sample taken within this plume and the PID sensor's measurement from that specific period where the canister sample was taken. Next slide, please. So then we apply these 2 conversion factors to each minute in a larger period around that plume, those plume measurements, using the plume conversion factor for those minutes when the plume was hitting the sensor and the ambient conversion factor for those minutes when the sensor was measuring ambient air. Next slide. And then once we have a bunch of minute by minute benzene estimates in that time around the plume record, we simply select the benzene estimates from a 60-minute window, which includes that plume, and average them up to create a 1-hour benzene estimate. In this case, the 1-minute data to 1-hour estimate averaged out to 6.5 parts per billion. So using this PID sensor output makes the model much more accurate than our basic napkin math method. And we can do even better with higher resolution data. But we haven't implemented that in our regular analysis packages. Next slide. So in all, Ajax has captured and analyzed over 275 auto-triggered canister samples. We've also tested the method assumptions with co-located trigger samples set to trigger at different VOC intensity levels within the same plume, and with co-located trigger samples with differing canister sample durations, 1 minute and 15 minutes. So here's an example of this estimating method applied to a plume in Broomfield, where we triggered a co-located 1-minute sample and a 15-minute sample with 2 separate PID sensor systems during the exact same plume event. These 2 different samples from 2 different sensors within the same plume provided 1-hour benzene estimates within 1% of each other. And while we haven't automated this model to account for our lower 15-second time resolutions, in our early tests, the model accuracy just continues to improve as we increase that time resolution. So the logical next steps for a model like this are to start incorporating network-wide spatial data to inform reasonable assumptions about how long the plume may have actually been occurring, and how a plume may have migrated and dispersed under the real world wind conditions at the time. So that concludes my testimony, and I look forward to questions. With that, I'll hand it off to Dr. Weisner.
Thank you, Mr. Buck, and good morning, commissioners. Next slide, please. Before I start, I want to note one thing. We know that this commission is very interested in the Broomfield Health Study and our air quality monitoring program. We have some rebuttal slides to the remarks made yesterday, and we are happy to present those after this presentation if the commission desires. As you may already know, the City and County of Broomfield Department of Public Health and Environment, along with researchers from the University of Colorado School of Public Health, conducted a large health study in 2021. We collected health data from 427 randomly identified Broomfield residents living in separate households to better understand self-reported health symptoms associated with living in proximity to oil and gas development. Our study is the first, to our knowledge, to address health impacts of living near multiple multi-well horizontal oil and gas pads. We used fishnet sampling methodology in ArcGIS 10.8.1 software to identify randomly selected households that would receive a postcard in the mail. So I want to reiterate that households were completely selected at random. We weighted the distribution of randomly selected households to account for differences in population density across Broomfield. The map on your left indicates the location of nearly 4,000 randomly selected households that received a postcard in the mail. The darker the color indicates more households were selected in that area. The blue line on the map indicates 1 mile from oil and gas. The orange line indicates 2 miles from unconventional oil and gas development. After responses were collected, we then used ArcGIS to calculate the distance between each respondent's residence and each oil and gas site in Broomfield to better understand symptoms and proximity to these sites. Our target sample size to have a valid statistical power was 383, and we surpassed that and received a total of 427 responses for an overall response rate of 10.7%. Next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about our methods, and I want to say that the methods we used in this study are well established in the scientific and epidemiological literature. We modeled this study off of many other oil and gas studies conducted in states like Pennsylvania, Colorado, Texas, and California, which use similar methodologies and ask about many of the same self-reported health symptoms that we asked our residents about. I do want to mention that while CTEH states self-reported symptoms are not a reliable measure of health impacts, numerous published epidemiological studies rely on self-reported health symptoms. In fact, the first thing you do when you visit your doctor is self-report your symptoms. When conducting a large health study such as this, you need a tool to collect data, and a survey is an appropriate and widely accepted tool in epidemiological research, even with the limitations it may have. CTEH has criticized the way we conducted our study, but in their screening level health risk evaluation, they did not talk to the public nor ask any residents about health symptoms that they may be experiencing living near oil and gas. And they only stated if air quality measurements were above or below health guideline values. There was no statistical analysis conducted with actual health symptoms reported. I work for the Department of Public Health for the City and County of Broomfield, as you all know. It is my job to engage the public on these matters, and it is also my job to ensure that they know why we are asking about health symptoms, and disclosing that this research was about oil and gas was required per the University of Colorado's Multiple Institutional Review Board, which approved this research design. Disclosing that the Broomfield Health Study was in relation to oil and gas is not considered to be priming residents for responses by the University of Colorado's Multiple Institutional Review Board. Broomfield has raised concerns with how CTEH conducts their studies, and I want to note that Dr. McMullen stated they used the same methodologies for studies conducted at 6 other well pads. So that means our concerns apply to the other studies they've conducted. And I do want to state what Ms. Pirano's also said, that Broomfield did not have an opportunity to review those studies that were done on those 6 other pads, as they were not provided to exhibits to us, and those links were broken. I'm going to shift back to the Broomfield Health Study and talk about the methodologies we used. So we grouped our 427 adult responses into 3 distance categories from unconventional oil and gas as an estimate of exposure. We then grouped symptoms into the following 8 categories, and we did not choose these 8 categories randomly. We chose these categories of symptoms based on what was in the published epidemiological literature, physiology, and a method called principal components analysis, where you can see how symptoms load together in this statistical method. So you can see the 8 categories below that we looked at: total number of symptoms, frequency of the total number of symptoms, upper respiratory, lower respiratory, acute, neurological, gastrointestinal, and mental health. And while we did sum the Likert scores of the symptoms within each category, that is also a well-established method used in many other epidemiological studies. We applied the method of least squares linear regression to then test the association between resident setback distance to oil and gas and the overall number of symptoms and frequency of symptoms. We ran separate models for adults and children because children did not provide responses for themselves, their parents did. And we adjusted for covariates such as smoking or ever smoked, number of chronic health conditions reported, number of children under 18 years of age living in the household, how often someone exercises, number of alcoholic drinks consumed each week, hours per day spent at your home, level of education, race, ethnicity, and years at current residence, to name some of our confounders. Next slide. So what did we find? Well, what we found was that adult respondents living within 1 mile of an unconventional oil and gas site in Broomfield reported significantly greater frequencies of upper respiratory and acute symptoms. And those acute symptoms were nausea, vomiting, nosebleeds, lung irritation, shortness of breath, cough, and throat irritation than the respondents living more than 2 miles away. Respondents living within 2 miles of an oil and gas site also reported that their children experienced significantly greater frequencies of lower respiratory, gastrointestinal, and acute response symptoms than those living greater than 2 miles away. Among all respondents, regardless of distance from oil and gas, level of concern with odors, noise, and air pollution impacted the frequency of symptoms reported. And I'm happy to discuss this further in our rebuttal slides, as CTEH challenged and confused the interpretation of this. Next slide, please. Broomfield's investigation is consistent with the findings of other epidemiological health studies that use similar methodologies. Other studies in Pennsylvania's Marcellus Shale found respondents living closer to a natural gas well site were more likely to report upper respiratory symptoms like sinus and nasal problems, cough, and sore throat. The studies done in Pennsylvania, however, are different from ours in the sense that we evaluated exposure to living in proximity to multiple unconventional multi-well oil and gas pads, where the Pennsylvania studies are more focused on single well sites, and they have different distances associated with their health impacts. With that being said, it is reasonable to conclude that the reason we saw an increase in symptoms being reported up to 2 miles away is because our residents live in proximity to 6 multi-well pads, not just single well sites. We also know that studies show HAP emissions continue throughout the life of the well and can be the greatest during the production phase, continually exposing residents to air pollutants for many years. The Broomfield Health Study is the first to observe increases in nosebleeds, nausea, vomiting, and shortness of breath symptoms near unconventional oil and gas sites. Many previous studies evaluated exposure proximity to unconventional natural gas and oil sites, including single well sites. And again, we evaluated proximity to these very large multi-well pads. Larger multi-well sites that include oil extraction may increase cumulative impacts from exposure to air pollutants such as VOCs, which are commonly emitted from these oil and gas sites and can cause a variety of health reactions, including but not limited to nose and throat irritation, dizziness, and nausea. And that's according to the US EPA. I want to be clear that there is an abundance of evidence and studies that point to very similar findings about health impacts near oil and gas sites. These studies are as good as it gets, and there are no other technological advances in epidemiological studies which can make the findings clearer that living in proximity to oil and gas is associated with various symptoms. Civitas's emissions inventory likely understates total emissions from the project, as emissions based on estimates using standard emission factors assume an average level of emissions per equipment or component. Average emissions factors do not account for abnormal operations such as equipment or operational malfunction, which can result in significantly higher emissions. Broomfield's air quality monitoring system frequently captures air quality events that appear to be associated with operations or activities when hydrocarbons are exposed to the atmosphere and not within a closed loop system. And as Mr. Valdez mentioned, we have seen some instances where our inspection reports suggest activity is aligned with air quality events like agitation of drill cuttings, servicing or emptying the sand cans during flowback, and mill out of set plugs after hydraulic stimulation. I'd also like to note that while we do compare our air quality findings to health guideline values, Broomfield's been very clear that the results of our trigger canisters are compared to health guideline values as a benchmark for understanding potential exposure. I want to mention some of the limitations of health guideline values. A health guideline value, they don't exist for combinations of chemicals. They're for individual chemicals. And we know our residents and those living near oil and gas are not exposed to just one chemical. Multiple pollutants and VOCs come off of these pads, as we've seen in our air quality monitoring. I also want to state that health guideline values, for example, for benzene, are based on very dated science. For example, the health guideline value for benzene is based on a 1984 study where mice were exposed to benzene for 6 hours a day for 6 days at 10,200 parts per billion. The researchers in this 1984 study did not consider health impacts like upper respiratory, gastrointestinal, lower respiratory, and other short-term health impacts. Rather, they only looked at changes in the blood with these mice. They were not looking at symptoms like headaches, eye irritation, nosebleeds, etc. Toxicological studies generally do not look at these types of symptoms, so health guideline values don't consider at what level someone might experience those symptoms. The researchers in the 1984 study also did not reserve a no observable adverse effect level, NOAEL, and that is the level at which no observed adverse impacts are found. So in other words, that study did not ever state what the lowest level is that someone would experience a health impact. Next slide. This map shows us the Broomfield population exposure to oil and gas. The map highlights that existing urban areas are within 2 miles of the proposed Coslet location and within 2 miles of producing single oil and gas well sites. This map also highlights future residential development is within 1 mile of the proposed Coslet location. Next slide. The proposed location would put nearly all of Broomfield north of 144th Avenue within 2 miles of a multi-well unconventional pad. This includes many residential neighborhoods. A residential neighborhood exists 2 miles from the Coslet East well site and 2 miles from the United Pad and Interchange pads, which are Extraction's multi-well sites in Broomfield. 2 other multi-well sites, Northwest A and Northwest B, are very close to being within that 2 mile radius as well. Living in proximity to oil and gas sites increases the likelihood of exposure to multiple air pollutants and combinations of chemicals, as studies highlight that HAP emissions continue and are often the greatest during the production phase. Next slide. In conclusion, Broomfield urges this commission to deny the proposed Coslet East pad due to the threat to the health of residents living within 2 miles from the proposed pad by the cumulative emissions from the proposed pad and existing pads. Broomfield's monitoring demonstrates that even tankless facilities drilled with electric rigs and using synthetic drilling muds and other BMPs proposed by Crestone emit hazardous air pollutants that can threaten public health. Thank you. And that concludes our presentation.
Thank you for the presentation. So at this point, I believe let's see, cross-examination by Crestone, and then response by City and County of Broomfield, and then commissioner questions.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Crestone doesn't have any cross-examination questions at this point. I think we'll hit on most of our concerns as part of our rebuttal.
Then, okay, then I assume, Ms. Baranos, that there's no response by the City and County of Broomfield.
That is correct.
Okay, moving right along, we now will move into commissioner questions. Which commissioner has initial questions? Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess I would be interested in Ms. Wisner's rebuttal. I think she said she had some slides. If we wanted to see them, I'd be interested in those before I start my questions.
Certainly. Thank you, Commissioner McGowan. Mindy, can we go ahead and present those rebuttal slides? Commissioner McGowan, would you like to see the rebuttal slides from Mr. Valdez as well?
Yes.
Yes, sorry, I'm having trouble with my button.
Great, thank you.
So we're going to go through the presentation here. So next slide, Mindy. All right, so as we've discussed, our air quality monitoring system was designed to capture and measure plumes both near source and in neighborhood receptor locations. So this is where the potential human exposure could occur. While most of our network was clustered around the active pads, we do have about half a dozen locations in surrounding neighborhoods, as well as an engaged resident population who were given air canisters that could be triggered manually. While we will admit that it is rare, atmospheric conditions line up perfectly for secondary samples to be captured, we did observe one such instance on September 16th, 2021, near the Northwest B pad, shown in orange on the map here. This pad was being actively drilled at the time. So an automatic trigger canister sample was taken, shown in the teal color there, at about 300 feet from the pad. And a resident to the south smelled a petrochemical odor and took a manual sample, shown there in red. And that's the resident's home is about 1,000 feet from the pad. While the resident's canister did show lower concentrations of VOCs, the composition signatures of the two canisters did line up almost perfectly. So given that the winds were also blowing from the north, the data is highly suggestive that we were observing the same plume. We have cataloged 6 similar events in neighborhood locations, 3 of which had 1 minute benzene over 9 parts per billion. And while plume dispersion is observed in these events, plumes containing HAPs do appear to be able to travel significant distances, like we saw with the December 4th event that I spoke about earlier. And I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Mr. Valdez. I'll go ahead with my rebuttal slides here. So CTEH stated that the distance from the well pad does not equal community air concentrations, claiming that VOCs disperse. Our response is that Broomfield's air quality monitoring program has multiple instances of plumes with oil and gas signatures traveling into communities. And as Mr. Valdez just highlighted, some of those plumes do travel up to a mile that we've seen. CTEH claims that self-reported health symptoms are not a reliable measure of health impacts, that they are biased, and that the symptoms we asked about could have other causes such as COVID, pre-existing conditions, and behavioral factors. Our response is that, as I've stated, many studies, epidemiological studies, use self-reported health symptoms. We do acknowledge in our research that self-reported symptoms can have a bias, but you must be aware that bias always goes in both directions. It doesn't just go in one direction. Also, we controlled for pre-existing conditions and behavioral factors. And we had no reason to believe that COVID rates would be higher in a community near the oil and gas pads. So COVID has been going on for a couple of years now, and it happens throughout communities. We didn't have any reason to believe that living near a gas pad would mean, you have higher rates of COVID. CTEH claims that there's no clear dose response shown in our study. We did not state we were trying to do that, and that was not one of the goals of the Broomfield Health Study. Next slide. CTEH analyzed the public Broomfield Health Survey data and found results that were different from ours. They found the average total number of self-reported symptoms were similar for residents within 1 mile compared to those residents more than 2 miles away. So I really want to stress that this is inaccurate and misleading because they did not state that they adjusted for confounding variables. So in epidemiological literature, you have to understand and adjust that, some people may be smoking in their house. They may be older or younger, have a bunch of pre-existing health conditions or things that can contribute to why they may experience these health symptoms. So you have to adjust for them. CTEH did not adjust for them. They just did a very simple analysis of the raw data. We adjusted for these confounding variables, and there's many ways you can analyze data, but we are only interested in sound scientific methods that are well established in the epidemiological literature, which includes adjusting for confounders. CTEH states that our associations were lost when we removed residents most concerned about air, odor, and noise. Again, this interpretation is misleading. We conducted a mediation analysis, which found overall, people are concerned about air quality, odor, and noise all throughout Broomfield. So the people that are extremely concerned about these 3 environmental issues, they do not live near just near oil and gas. They live all throughout Broomfield. And for those living within 1 mile of oil and gas, we found that those least concerned about air, odor, and noise reported fewer symptoms, and those most concerned reported more symptoms. So this could be due to the possibility that feeling unwell causes one to seek out explanations such as environmental factors. If you have allergies, you may be more aware of what seasons bother you, what trees are pollinating, and that kind of thing. We did acknowledge that there is a potential for subjective bias among those most and least concerned, but that bias would go in both directions. So we have residents that are against oil and gas, and I hear from residents that are very much for oil and gas. So, a bias goes both ways. And seeing a potential for a bias does not invalidate the results. In fact, it's our duty as researchers to call out when there could be a potential for bias. And we did just that. Next slide. CTEH claims that researchers did not consider obsequious bias, where participants collaborate with researchers and give answers in the direction they perceive are of interest to the research. This is not possible because surveys were sent out to randomly selected households using a well-established method, fishnet sampling. We didn't have any control over where the surveys were getting sent. It was just randomly selected homes. So surveys were completed by residents at their discretion. So you didn't have to do it if you didn't want, and they were returned anonymously. We did not collect names. Thus, the possibility for this type of bias it's not possible. CTEH claims residents were primed to think about oil and gas before completing the survey. And as I mentioned, this was reviewed and approved by an IRB board, which is a very extensive and rigorous process. They require us to be transparent about the survey and state what it was about. So we had to do that. And, if you want to conduct sound ethical research and talk to people about their health symptoms, you have to go through an IRB board if you intend to publish your research, which we are in the process of doing. So, this IRB, they look at everything, and they don't want the research to be biased, and they don't want residents to be primed to think about oil and gas, but they do require that we are very transparent about what this research was about. So we did that. Next slide. I'm not going to go over this because it's about health guideline values, and I already covered that in my presentation. So next slide. My last slide, CTEH claims that a self-reported symptom study cannot be used to determine causality, and they are correct. And we did not make any claims about causality. We acknowledge this study cannot determine if the self-reported health symptoms were caused by exposure to emission from oil and gas. And additional studies will not be able to prove causation either. As I stated, these types of studies are as good as it gets near oil and gas. We're not going to have these huge technological advances which help us prove without a doubt, certainty, yep, this emissions causes this type of reaction. Science can't do that at this point. But what this study does do is it provides evidence that adults living within 1 mile of unconventional oil and gas sites in Broomfield and children living within 2 miles of these same sites self-reported health symptoms associated with the air pollutants emitted from oil and gas, more so than people living at distances greater than 2 miles away. Thus, Broomfield concludes there is no scientific justification for the COGCC to wait for the results of additional health studies before making decisions about preventing exposure from the proposed Coslet well site and the possible health consequences. And that concludes my rebuttal slides. Thank you, Mindy, for presenting those.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner McGowan. You still have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have a bunch of questions and I'm trying to organize myself, but it's useless. So they're probably going to be a little scattered. I was wondering if, I guess this question is for both for Ajax and for the survey, which is, multiple questions. Do the canisters speciate where HAPs are from? So can it tell that it's from oil and gas or from cars or from road construction? So that's my first question.
Okay, I can take that one, Commissioner. Canisters do not perfectly, have a fingerprint for what was the source of an emission, but there are some indicators within the composition of a canister that are well proven and have continued to be validated through this work. One of which is the ida and pentane ratio. So a ratio of one compound versus another can be very indicative of a more pure oil and gas subsurface emission versus a more pure traffic emission. And then there's some gray area in the middle where the two types of emissions mix and the composition is some oil and gas, some traffic. So in certain cases, we can fingerprint effectively the composition of a canister to say that was very much clearly a subsurface oil and gas emission.
And so this is a weird question maybe, but can you give me a percentage of how many of the samples you feel were mostly oil and gas related?
I cannot, though I will state that any number I did give you would be somewhat biased as we focus most of our monitoring efforts near oil and gas sources where we are targeting a specific source. So
okay.
I don't have the number though.
Okay. When you were taking your emission measurements from the canisters, did you have canisters that were 1 and 2 miles away from oil and gas locations?
We have not. Most of our community monitoring is within a mile of the oil and gas pad. Resource feasibility of putting sensors in 2 mile radius it's just too expensive for that.
And so for those canisters that are further away, did you find fewer measurements that were higher in various HAPs or VOCs or BTECs, et cetera?
Yes, correct. Oftentimes that dispersion does happen. So as you move farther from the pad, those canisters that we do collect or trigger do have lower concentrations of VOCs and HAPs.
And could you tell me, and I'm there's just a lot of data here, so I apologize if you did share this and I missed it.
Totally understand.
Of the canisters that were 2,000 feet or further away, did you find any, 9 parts per billion or greater of benzene measurements, for example, or anything that was concerning from a health?
Andrew, take that one.
Yeah, so maybe I can share my screen. I have a visual representation of the December 4th event. Let me see if I can do this. Everyone see this?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so this is somewhat of an outlier event, but it was significant. And I do want to correct the record. The December 4th event, the suspected source was actually the Northwest A pad and not United, as I stated previously. So we had winds blowing from the west southwest to the east northeast. And these blue stars here are our sensor locations. This one at United 2 was the furthest away at about 4,000 feet. So the event started about 4:06 in the morning, and we had a 1-minute benzene of 25 parts per billion. The Northwest 3 sensor triggered then at 4:16 a.m., and it appeared to kind of catch the shoulder of the plume at 12 parts per billion. But as it traveled further east at United 1 at 4:37, we had another trigger, also at 25 parts per billion for the 1-minute sample. And then again, United 2 at 4:45 a.m. And it appeared to either catch the shoulder or disperse further at 15 parts per billion. So from source to furthest location, the plume remained about 60% intact as it traveled across the landscape. This was a unique circumstance because the winds were consistent and pretty calm. But this is an event that captured pretty clearly a transport of a mostly intact noxious plume.
Thank you. I think this is for Ajax. I think I saw in Crestone's exhibits that there is a quarterly report that Ajax submits for Broomfield, and I'm not going to get the wording right. Does your quarterly report, all the quarterly reports state that from the data that you've been collecting, you haven't seen any values that have violated the CDPHE health risk standards? I'm not sure I'm wording this right, and I'm not sure if you know what exhibit I'm talking about.
I am familiar with the exhibit and all of our quarterly reports. It is true that all of our quarterly reports clarify whether we've seen any measurements over the health guideline value or not. We do have some quarterly reports that state that the acute health guideline values were surpassed with triggered canisters based on our 1-hour estimation model. The long-term health guideline standards are much higher than any ambient conditions we've measured in our 1-week duration canisters. Does that answer your question, Commissioner?
Yeah, yes, thank you. I think I'm also having a little trouble understanding the canister that collects the 1-minute sample. And then this assumption that you said, if you're like doing the most conservative kind of modeling, you would assume that just for that 1 minute, something triggered that was above the trigger level that you pick. And I'm going to assume that you want it to turn on if it senses something near 9 parts per billion for benzene, for example. And then with this other modeling that you're using, you're going to assume that the events around that 1 minute are probably also around above near 9 parts or more per billion, and then you're modeling off of that. I'm sorry, this is
understood.
Okay. So the canister, is it only able to trigger once, so you can only collect a 1 minute sample and then you have to assume everything around it? Or does the canister trigger itself multiple times when the trigger level has been set by an air event? I guess I'm trying to understand why you have to assume what's happening around the 1 minute. And maybe it's a limitation of the canister collection.
Okay, that's a good answer. So, and a canister is a bullet. It's one-time use. But there are systems on the market nowadays that can trigger multiple canisters. You could trigger one and then 5 minutes later trigger another, and 5 minutes later another. The challenge with that is cost that up extremely quickly. You could quickly blow $4,000 on trying to characterize an event. not knowing really, was it a good event to capture or kind of a waste? So for those reasons, assumptions are usually made for resource constraints, right? So it's for those reasons that we trigger that 1 minute canister to try to characterize that plume in the heart of the plume itself. Think about Andrew's graphic there, try to capture it right in the middle as much as we can. And then we have to make some assumptions about how that plume might have moved and what the concentration levels at that site were over a longer period of time.
Okay, thanks. That it's complicated. My last question, I guess, is for maybe everybody, which is I realize that we're talking about oil and gas right now, but I feel like there are probably other activities that also have some acute implications or effects for the population around that activity. So reconstructing a road or constructing a new road construction, building houses where you have cement truck coming in and its engine is running and then the cement is also emitting things. And so I'm just wondering if the survey and or these samples that have been taken have also taken into account other activities that might be happening in these communities and how that is taken into account in your measurements.
Thanks, Commissioner McGowan. I can start. When we conducted the Broomfield Health Study, we did look at all other potential sources that could contribute to some of those health symptoms. And we looked at where all the major roadways are. There is a major roadway in the southwest corner of Broomfield. We have a lot of residents that live down there by that, and we did not have an increase in reporting of symptoms. So, we thought about, how could roadways and that kind of thing impact health? One of the things is that when we do capture these air quality samples near the pads, we can look at that I to N pentane ratio. Is it more characteristic of traffic emissions versus oil and gas signatures? And as Mr. Buck stated, it's not perfect. Sometimes it's sort of in the gray, it's a mixture of both. But a lot of times our air samples are very much characteristic of oil and gas signatures. We don't see a whole lot of trigger canisters associated with just traffic emissions. So we don't have any reason to believe that there is some huge excess of traffic emissions that's negatively impacting the population near oil and gas, more so than our other residents that live near major roadways. So we definitely carefully considered traffic, roadways, and then other industries that could be located within Broomfield and around the area. And there's really not a whole lot of other things that could have contributed to this increase in the symptom reporting near the oil and gas pads.
Thank you. And another question for you, which is, how do you explain folks saying that they are experiencing symptoms 1 mile and 2 miles away when I think your actual air monitoring has one outlier that shows a violation at 4,000 feet. And that's the biggest trigger. Otherwise, we're not seeing emissions violating certain health risk guideline standards.
Well, I would say—
What are your thoughts about it, I guess? Sorry, just what are your thoughts about it?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. So we've had a couple of different times where the wind was blowing just right. We had a plume at one of the pads and it hit our sensors at Soaring Eagle in the Anthem community, and that was a 1 mile distance. So we saw plumes that had the same chemical compositions at the pads and then travel into communities, and they were much more diluted. How do we explain the increase in symptoms within the 1 and 2 miles? Well, one of the things I would say is health guideline values aren't set at levels that even consider things like nosebleeds, headaches, upper respiratory issues. So as I stated, the benzene health guideline value is based on a 1984 study. Mice were put into a controlled environment for 6 hours a day for 6 days. And then researchers looked at how their blood changed, how there were effects to their blood changes. Nothing else was assessed. And it wasn't like the mice were exposed incrementally to see, okay, at what level do we see some type of health impact in mice? It was just, they were just exposed to 10,200 ppb. Then they said, the researchers said, let's convert that to a human. And when they converted it to a human, it's just some simple division, and they account for uncertainty factors and sensitive population and reach 9 parts per billion. So that 9 parts per billion acute health guideline value is the safe level for what exposure could be when somebody's, around benzene for up to 2 weeks. However, that is not for the health symptoms that we're seeing. That's only for changes to the blood, because that's all the researchers looked at. And that's a really dated study. It would be nice to see toxicology researchers update that. So I think that the symptoms that we're seeing reported could be due to this combination of chemicals that residents are being exposed to within their communities near oil and gas. And, they're just experiencing symptoms that toxicology research has never touched on.
Thank you. And I think this is for now my last question. In thinking about, what I think I hear you saying is right, that by adding this pad, we're going to have more residences that will be affected or impacted by now multiple oil and gas sites. But how do you know that this is the site that is going to change anything significantly from what's happening in community right now that puts you over the top, so to speak, or are you not trying to say that?
Well, I think we're proceeding with caution here. We're seeing that children, are more sensitive bodies, and they're experiencing greater health impacts up to 2 miles from these pads. What we're saying is there's a possibility, based on what we've found, for people living within 2 miles of the proposed causelet location to possibly have these adverse symptoms as well, because there are communities that are going to be within 2 miles of multiple pads. And our research is different than a lot of other studies, because our population in Broomfield, they don't live just near, one multi-well pad. They live near 6 of them. And we think that that's probably one of the big reasons why we're seeing this increase in symptoms. So adding in another large, very large mega pad site with, 19 proposed wells is going to add to these cumulative impacts, because people are going to be exposed to more toxins within a certain distance band, since they already live near extraction 6 well sites. And then this causelet site is introducing another potential for exposure to air pollutants. So it's the potential for exposure that concerns us. And of course, I wouldn't say this is an absolute, it's a potential. And we think that's reason enough to proceed with caution here.
Thanks everyone for the responses.
Any questions, Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentations. I do have a few questions, and like Commissioner McGowan, they're going to be all over the place. But there's a few things that I want to make sure that I understand. I love it when scientists argue to a lay person, because to me that just calls into question all of the science. But at the same time, I want to make sure that I try to understand it. So I'll start with Mr. Valdez, because you started, and I'll just kind of try to work down the list here. But so let's talk a little bit about where the locations of some of these air monitors are when you were a part of this program. And I think I'm understanding from what I've read and from the testimony that the majority of those are around 300 feet away from the specific sites. And then there's a handful of them that are in neighborhoods approximately 1,000 feet away. Is that right?
1,000 feet. It does depend. So since we have 6 pads, we have different distances from different sources and different receptors. Nothing further than 1 mile. As was discussed, and then the near source stuff is all 300 feet from the active pads.
Okay. How many do you have in between 1,000 and 2,000 feet?
Okay. This is how I would characterize it. I would say we have, I think 5 or 6 what we would consider community locations. But, you know, the Livingston sensor site is more than 1,000 feet from the United sensor site, right? So it just depends on what you're measuring.
Okay. All right, that helps. And then in all of the air monitoring that Broomfield's done, with their specific air monitoring, you've had a few instances at the 300-foot level that have had spikes in, and this also maybe is for Mr. Buck. I know that these things, these programs interact with one another. But the majority of the spikes were captured at the 300-foot level. There was a couple of instances where there was subsequent capturing at 1,000 feet or 2,000 feet, but those all had to be manually set off. Is that right?
No. So to get to your first question, it's correct to say that the majority of automatic triggers that we had were near source. And they were really more outlier events that we observed automatically triggering further downwind. And the downwind sensors were also on the automatic triggering system. The event that I talked about on September 16th was just kind of a one-off from a resident who had a canister who smelled something and then kind of manually triggered it.
Okay. And how many beyond 2,000 feet have been automatically triggered above health values?
I think the December 4th event might be the only one I would have any confidence in saying absolutely happened and had an oil and gas source that traveled that far.
Okay.
In
And
the-
in that one, if I go ahead, Mr. Buck, I apologize.
I was just going to clarify as well. When you look at probability of capture, which is an important kind of thing to think about as you think about this space and distances. Each monitoring station, the farther it gets from a source, the narrower the window of capturing a plume is, right? So without 360 sensors around a source, there's always, 358 vectors that you're not going to see. And the farther you go, the harder it is to hit those monitors at that longer distance. So
I mean, some of that has to be
sources
dispersion as well, right?
Yeah, dispersion plus probability of capture, it becomes exceptionally more difficult and less probable that you're actually going to see anything, whether it existed or not, the farther away from the pad you go. So that's where statistics has to get involved and start making assumptions that someone could reasonably believe on how often is this happening out in the world. And that's beyond the scope of what Ajax is currently doing for Broomfield.
Okay, thank you. On the December 4th incident, which is the one that was captured beyond 2,000 feet, I think I read either in your presentation or in some of the information that was provided that there was multiple activities going on in each of the sites, multiple pre-production activities going on in each of the sites that could have cumulatively created the levels that we're seeing. Is that right?
Yeah, Commissioner Messner. So Q4 of 2021 was the quarter that we just had kind of more overall total actual triggers, but that December 4th event looked to be from one activity at one pad.
Okay, I thought in your presentation there was something about a washer in one of the pads and something about something else in the other pads that combined potentially caused that elevated level, but maybe I was mistaken.
Yeah, I think I think we were just trying to make the point that from a total number of captured triggers, that quarter was the most active, and it also coincided with the fact that there were simultaneous operations at multiple pads.
Okay. Okay. All right. So, and then there was, and just so I understand, there was one instance in there where there was a 1 minute capture, and I think this is for you, Mr. Buck. That was 223 parts per billion. Was that December 4th? And where was that? Was that a 300 feet away?
Yes, it was within one of our 300-foot near source monitoring sites. I cannot right now tell you when or where that occurred. I don't have that data in front of me.
It was the nearest to the pad, and it was a 1 minute capture. No, I'm sorry, was not a 1 minute capture. The 223 was a 1 hour calculation. Nearest to the source, nearest to the pad.
1 hour modeling based on a 1 minute capture. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. All right. So I think I have general questions about some of the things. I mean, I appreciate the information and the air quality monitoring that Broomfield's doing. And I acknowledge that there's a survey that Broomfield has done around this. My understanding is that over the last year or so, Broomfield has updated its oil and gas regulations, both for new oil and gas operations that occur within the jurisdiction, as well as reciprocal setbacks. Can someone remind me what those are within Broomfield's jurisdiction?
I think I can take this, Commissioner Messner, unless Andrew, you're familiar with the reciprocal setbacks that have been adopted.
Yeah, I could speak briefly to reciprocal setbacks. So our reverse setback rule establishes land development restrictions based off of existing oil and gas infrastructure, with the exception of the 6 pads that we've talked about today. There's no other kind of multi-well pads in Broomfield, so we have a lot of the kind of one-off stuff. And I think our setback, Ms. Burton-Zetti can correct me, is 250 feet from active legacy infrastructure. We don't allow residential building units.
So 250 feet away from existing oil and gas assets. I guess I was under the understanding that you did 2,000 feet, but maybe that was for new oil and gas activity. Is that right? Or oil and gas activity that hadn't undergone pre-production?
Oh, right. So new oil and gas developments would require, and this was pre-181, 2,000 foot setback, and that essentially made most, like 99% of Broomfield, unavailable to new oil and gas development.
Okay. How many individual wells are there in Broomfield's jurisdiction? Does anyone know the answer to that?
About 110 like conventional vertical wells, and then the 6 pads, I think, have they were permitted for 84. They ended up completing 65.
And so all oil and gas activity in Broomfield is in the production stage?
Yes, for purposes of this conversation, yes.
Okay. And in your analysis when you were the oil and gas development director or specialist for Broomfield, some of that determination for allowing residents to be within 250 feet of oil and gas locations was because those wells are in production?
We made a delineation between legacy and unconventional, I would say. although, one of the things that we do see in the data is that once wells are in production, there is less emissions.
Okay, thanks. One other question is that, and I'm just trying to understand kind of what happened here. At one point, my understanding was in reading pre-hearing statements and responses, is that there was conversations at one point between Broomfield and Civitas around potentially P&Aing 19 wells to offset the 19 wells that they were contemplating in this application. But Broomfield chose to not pursue that. I wonder if someone could enlighten me on those conversations and why Broomfield didn't think that having 19 wells P&A may help offset some of the cumulative impacts.
Yeah, I think I can speak to that, Commissioner Messner. I think starting in May of 2021, staff has a good working relationship with folks at Crestone and Civitas. And we began having sort of informal bilateral conversations about this P&A agreement. And at the end of the day, it was a political decision not to pursue the agreement.
Okay. Thank you. That was an honest answer, and I appreciate that. I think at this point, that's the extent of my questions. Thank you for answering them.
Further questions, Commissioner Cross?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation this morning. I'll start off as the prior commissioners did. I'll try and go down my list here, and so hopefully stay in order of the presentation. So I guess starting with Mr. Valdez, one of the things that you mentioned was that pre-production can last for years. Do you have an understanding of how long the pre-production will take for this application, this proposed project?
I believe it was somewhere around 12 to 16 months, year and a half or so.
Okay. And I'll be honest, I think that one of the things that I'd like to look at is if you could pull up the slides again, kind of go into that. I know it had the December 4th, it had the green writing on it, it had the United One, some of the higher hits from your canisters, including, I think it had 2 from the December 4th and 1 from December 3rd.
Yeah, give me just a minute here. All right. All right, is this the slide you were looking for?
Yes, yes. And so I just wanted to touch on it to make sure that I understood this. And I'll be honest, I think a lot of my questions in relation to this were answered with respect to Commissioner McGowan's comments, because I also was trying to understand why you didn't do multiple tests there. And I guess one question out front is, the analogy given was it's kind of like a bullet. You get one bullet for the hits. How often do you go and load another bullet into the canister?
So contractually, it was a 48-hour turnaround, but our wonderful partners at Ajax would usually swap those out same day if it was anytime during daylight hours. So, a canister would be down or offline, I would say, in that quarter, probably no more than 12 hours. And usually sometimes a lot shorter than that.
So given that the December 4th incident occurred at 4 o'clock in the morning, by the time they would have loaded another bullet into the canister, so to say, that event would have passed.
Would have been next day, yeah.
Okay. And so I understand as I'm looking at this, the top two on December 4th and the fifth one down on December 4th, that's all in relation to the one event that was specifically highlighted in your visual representation, correct?
That's right. Yep.
And do you know what the December 3rd was?
So we dispatch one of our inspectors for all of these events. It looked like this one happened in the morning. So I'd need to go look and see exactly what operations were happening at that time. But we do have the phase kind of listed in there. So at the United Pad, they were in the middle of drilling and fracking and coiled tubing.
Okay. And perhaps this is with this slide still up, perhaps this is a good time to shift to Mr. Buck with Ajax. I kind of want to touch on this algorithm a little bit. Can you go into a little bit more detail of how you got to the 223 parts per billion for the benzene there?
I can, and I'm actually going to share. Oh, Andrew, could you please stop sharing? I'm going to share my screen if that pleases the commission and review this slide again. So I presume you can see this slide?
Yes.
So the way we can end up with a 1 hour estimate higher than our 1 minute factual measurement is when this plume event, which is represented here by the purple line, if that plume event stretches for a long period, 15, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, so meaning the plume stayed on our sensor for a very long time, coupled with a situation where we trigger the canister early in the plume, say on the shoulder of the plume, and then the plume gets more intense after we've fired our bullet or triggered our canister. So that means on a minute by minute basis, we could have a benzene concentration of 20 parts per billion, trigger it at 40 parts per billion, and then have 10 minutes straight of 200 plus parts per billion before dropping down to clean air estimates. So in that situation, when you average them up, you end up with many more elevated minutes of benzene within that plume, which can create those situations where you have higher benzene concentration in 1 hour at that place where the monitor sits.
Okay, and that makes sense. And I guess where my confusion comes from is, how do you tell the length of it? Because if you said the multiple minutes there, but if you kind of have the one shot, how do the sensors tell longer than the 1 minute?
So the purple line, which is our PID sensor, is measuring continuously. They measure less than 1 second resolution. So they're constantly adjusting based on the number of VOCs they see in the air. And so this purple line is a continuous trace. So we average it up to 1 minute averages for this calculation so that we can compare it with our trigger canister and do this calculation.
So the PID is doing continual, but the canisters are just doing the 15-second
correct
bullet approach. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to make sure that I properly understood that as we're going through it. And then you had mentioned that there was 6 different instances of a secondary trigger that was further than 300 feet away. You provided the one example with the December 4th event, but I believe you said there was 6 instances of it. And perhaps, Mr. Valdez, this was you. I apologize for that. Do you have an idea of the concentrations of those other events?
Brent, correct me if I'm wrong, but we had 3 of those 6 with 1 minute benzene over 9 parts per billion. Is that right?
Sounds correct, but I'm pulling up our data to help validate some of these questions.
And were those significantly above 9 parts per billion?
I don't believe so.
I'll let Mr. Buck find that.
Oh, my apologies. We have over 1 billion metrics that I'm sorting through here to make sure I find what we need.
So not for a loss of data.
Let's see. We have overall in all of our trigger canisters, and I'm not segmenting by near source or community source. In Broomfield only here. Oh, there they are. In benzene, in Broomfield only, we have 32 trigger canisters that were over 9 parts per billion on a 1 minute basis. So keep in mind, comparing to a health guideline value is weak in this case. Yeah, 32 that range from 9 parts per billion to 80 parts per billion.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. Then I think I'll move on to Dr. Weissner. First off, I just for confirmation purposes, you said there was a 10.7% response rate. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And I wanted to go into some of your responses to the criticisms of the study done. You had noted that self-reported symptoms are common in epidemiology studies. Can you tell us whether in some of those, and you mentioned, for example, when you go into a doctor, you'll kind of self-identify some symptoms, and so that's common. Do you know in those studies, is it common to have kind of a QA/QC of those symptoms? So you're not getting a hypochondriac in there saying like, oh, I'm having XYZ and this is why. Do they kind of quality check that or do any confirmation of the symptoms in those other studies that you mentioned?
Well, that's a great question. And I think that one of the ways that that's done is by adjusting for confounding variables. So we can ask individuals about, pre-existing health conditions. So if somebody is reporting, that they have lung irritation or throat irritation, and they also say they have a pre-existing condition like COPD or something, we would control for that. So, we try to look for answers other than oil and gas or other than air pollution that could be contributing to the symptoms. And that's why you would adjust for confounders. That's why it's really important to adjust for as many confounding variables. In other words, other explanations for these symptoms. And we adjusted for, nearly a dozen confounders. So when we do that, it helps even out everybody's health status to sort of a similar playing field to see if distance is one of the reasons that we might see an association with symptoms and distance from oil and gas. And I'm sorry if that's a little bit unclear, but adjusting for confounders would be the main way of doing that.
And is that what happens in some of the other studies as well? Just so you don't have to send, potentially 4,000 people to a doctor to say, are these symptoms real? Or are they not? That sort of thing. Okay.
Yes, the studies adjust as well.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure, because I'm sure we'll probably hear something about that coming back. I just wanted to make sure that I understood. And I think similarly, when you're doing kind of adjusting for those confounders, as you mentioned, do you also look at how long the duration, not just of a nosebleed or anything like that, but when did the nosebleeds begin? So for example, do you have anything in there of like, oh, we've been getting headaches since 2016 before some of these multi-well pads came in, or is that part of the study?
So that's a great question. So the Broomfield Health Study asked about symptoms you're experiencing in the past 2 weeks and how often you experience them. So we did not ask about, have you been getting chronic nosebleeds a couple years ago before, oil and gas activity started. But I will say we have a whole separate database that Mr. Valdez talked about where people reported to the city and county of Broomfield, which this was completely separate than the health study we did. So we had about 360 unique individuals report over 1,500 symptoms to us from 2019 up until now. The database is still ongoing, so residents can still report symptoms. And we had a huge uptick in these symptoms that happened right around pre-production in Livingston and the other pads in Broomfield. And in that database, we did ask, when did these symptoms start? Was it a new onset? Are you only experiencing it today? Or did this start, going way back? So we do have a record. And I will say, just with the data that we've collected, I would say that a lot of the symptoms, it's just a new onset. Somebody says, my child had a nosebleed, I'm just reporting it to you. We don't normally get nosebleeds. So a lot of our data does indicate that, but the Broomfield Health Study, it was only looking at symptoms over the past 2 weeks.
Okay. And I want to also, so you had some criticisms about the benzene study. I think you said it was done in the 80s and you just exposed the mice. Do you have any idea of how recently some of the other HAP studies have been done that the CDC acute levels have been determined on? Are there similar criticisms for those other HAPs, or are those kind of also going back to the 80s?
So that gets a little out of my wheelhouse, since I'm an epidemiologist and I can't speak to all of the health or all of the toxicology studies that have been done to determine health guideline values for, toluene or ethylbenzene or some other compound. Benzene, we focus on because we know it's a known carcinogen and we know there are known associated health impacts. So that's why toxicologists and epidemiologists tend to really hone in on benzene. So I'm not able to speak to the studies on the other compounds.
Okay. And a couple similar questions. At the very end of your presentation, you mentioned that even when rigs are electrified, you still emit HAPs. Do you have any kind of data or testimony that you can provide about the intensity of those HAPs when you're using an electric rig? Kind of how it compares to a diesel engine or a natural gas engine?
I would have to let our air quality experts take that one, or Mr. Valdez.
Oh, go ahead, Brent.
So if I caught the question correctly, it was, I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, Mr. President?
Sure. At the very end of Dr. Weisner's presentation, she made what I think is an important conclusion that said, because I think a lot of what you guys were looking at in the prior study was with respect to non-electrified engines. And she said, here, although it's going to be electrified, there still is emission of HAPs when you have electric rigs. And so I was just wondering if you have any kind of data or testimony about the intensity of those HAPs or the kind of the levels compared to a diesel engine or a natural gas engine.
I do not have anything prepared for that. That would be a better question for Dr. Collett at CSU's Atmospheric Science.
In brief, Commissioner Cross, we don't have an apples to apples comparison in Broomfield in our data for electrified versus diesel.
So you know that there'll still be some HAPs, but you just don't know the intensity compared to what was done with the prior study.
Yeah, the only thing we could offer would be anecdotal evidence of a diesel truck driving by, and we get a very clear combustion signal from a car or a vehicle, or someone rolling coal because they see the sensor. And that's anecdotal. I wouldn't offer it up as testimony.
Okay, I appreciate that. And Dr. Weisner, another thing that I wanted to touch on with your presentation is you showed a Venn diagram kind of the pre-existing, the 6 wells that you were multi-well pads that you looked at, and kind of showed the 2 mile there, and then you showed where the proposed Coslet pad would be, and there was an intersection that had some where people would be in both of those. And so I wanted to try and touch on that, and Commissioner Mesner's question also went into part of that. Those are no longer, the 6 multi-well pads are no longer in the pre-production phase, correct?
Currently, I believe that is correct.
Okay.
Yes.
So when you talked about another potential for exposure, it's not building on an ongoing exposure from pre-production that you're really highlighting.
Well, that's tricky because we don't know in the health science how acute exposures over time could contribute to long-term health impacts. So that's an unknown.
Okay. And then the other question, and I think I put this to the panel generally, do you know whether any of the people in Broomfield, particularly in that intersection of the Venn diagram, but some of the others have specifically protested or complained about the COGCC project?
I do not know any individuals and residents in that intersection neighborhood that I haven't communicated with any of them, and I don't know of any protests to the COGCC pad from them.
Okay, I appreciate that. And then I think I'll double check my notes here, but Dr. Weisner, I think one other question. And it kind of goes back to what Dr. McMullen had talked about yesterday during her presentation. She had mentioned that for the acute, you're still looking at the weeks, and it kind of goes back to the benzene study. The fact that even what the Ajax data is showing here is in some of these high upwards of the 223, but on average the 25 parts per billion and between 10 and the 25 parts per billion. Do you have any response with respect to the fact that that is still a short period of time, perhaps over an hour, and not over the multiple weeks that Dr. McMullen talked about yesterday?
Well, I do have a response to that. And, you know, our air quality monitoring system is not perfect. We have spent millions of dollars to try to do the state of the art, the absolute best we can. If we had more money, we could add more monitors. And, you know, when a trigger is, when an air quality sensor triggers a sample, you know, we have to wait for somebody to get out there and reload that canister. So we don't know. I mean, we get this 1 minute sample, but we don't know how much benzene is in the air all the time. We only know when a canister is triggered. So it's possible that another one could have been triggered if it was reloaded instantaneously, and another one. So I would say in response to some of the comments yesterday that yes, we don't see continuous exposure for 14 days over 9 parts per billion, but we're also very limited on what we can see. Wind directions shift. And it's not like there's just these constant steady plumes that are emanating from the pad. And I will also say that that health guideline value of 9, that's talking about changes in the blood. It's not talking about headaches and nosebleeds and the things that we're hearing about from our residents.
Okay, but the kind of reloading of the canisters is not going on for 2 weeks, and so it's not as though you're missing for something over a 2-week period. It's more of the 12 hours that was described earlier, correct?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand that.
So I believe Mr. Valdez earlier said that Ajax was usually able to kind of reload the canister, reload the bullet, so to say, within usually 12 hours, sometimes a little bit longer depending on daylight, that kind of thing, but it was usually within 12 hours. It wasn't that you were missing a nearby exposure over a week or 2 weeks or anything like that.
Right, that is, yes, that is correct.
That's fair. Most emissions are intermittent, ranging from 10 minutes of observation to looking across the network. You might see evidence that it may have been going on for 5 to 10 hours, but we're not talking about long emissions going for weeks.
And based on I believe it was the PID, the continual sensor, do you think that PID continual monitoring would have caught any of that kind of going on? What you're talking about of not being able to immediately get it, but did you see quick declines when you had some of these spikes, or were you noticing that going on for extended periods of time?
So the most common symptom, I guess, of a longer occurring plume, a plume over hours, is actually a spike on the PID when the plume hits the sensor, and then the wind might carry it somewhere else, and then it'll come back and touch the sensor again. And we can make the assumption that that was the same plume and it continued to exist, or we can make the assumption that that plume stopped and a different one came back. That's where we get into the realm of statistical guesswork, and we are extremely conservative about that. So that kind of thing doesn't usually go into our our reports.
Appreciate it. I also like this, the term statistical guesswork. That's so in looking about the, I know I have some general comments, but I think at this point in time, those are my only questions. So thank you again.
Thank you, Commissioner Cross. Further questions from commissioners? Commissioner Ackerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you everyone for your testimony today and for presenting the case. I appreciate it. It was very enlightening and helpful for me. I do have a couple of questions, and my first one's Dr. Weissner. I don't know if you're able to pull up the slide that showed the distribution of surveys with the intensifying areas of blue. Is that possible?
Sure. Mindy, is that something you could pull up?
If not, I can just continue on with the question. I don't think it's imperative that we look at the slide, but as she's trying to pull that up, I'll go ahead and ask the question. I think you had stated that you had a 10.7% overall response rate. From what I recall from that slide, the preponderance of the participants in the survey, or at least the people that were sent the survey card, were outside of the 2 mile area. And correct me if I'm wrong there. And my question is, do you have the response rate broken down in the same percentage by within a mile, within 2 miles, and outside of 2 miles? Does that question make sense to you?
Yeah, yes, it does. That's a great question. Our response rate was similar in all 3 distance bands. It wasn't much different at all. It ranged, I think it was from like 9 to 11% based on the distance band. And the majority of people that submitted responses lived outside of 2 miles, quite simply because that's where the majority of the Broomfield residents live.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me as well. There's the slide. Thank you so much. Yeah, and I thought it looked like the majority were outside of that. So appreciate that. Thanks for pulling that up. We can knock that back down. Appreciate that very much. And then, you know, I've been pondering kind of, as I've been thinking about the survey here, one of the difficulties with surveys, self-reporting surveys, and again, you have so much experience with this just due to this survey, but is interested participant bias, right? I used to work for the Division of Wildlife, and we would send out surveys asking if you harvested an animal or if you did not. And people that did were very excited to participate in the survey and let you know that they were successful, and people that did not, we struggled to find participation. So can you talk a little bit about how you considered participant bias and adjusted it across the within 1 mile, within 2 miles, and outside of 2 miles?
Thank you for that question. Participant bias is certainly always something that you have to face head on when you do these types of studies. And we looked at the different types of bias, affiliation bias, subjective bias, and that kind of thing, which could indicate, you know, responses were skewed one way or another. So the main way that we looked at bias was by asking people about their level of environmental concern for a number of environmental issues, lighting, dust, traffic, air, odor, noise, that type of thing. At Broomfield, the majority of the concerns that we receive from our residents are about air, odor, and noise, and oil and gas. So we said, okay, it's safe to assume that maybe those most concerned about air, odor, and noise have more awareness about oil and gas, since those concerns seem to come in hand. And that's what we did. So we started to look at the responses where people were the most concerned about air, odor, and noise versus the least concerned about air, odor, and noise. And what we found was people live all throughout Broomfield that are highly concerned about those things and that aren't concerned about those things. And we found that, you know, this is where it gets tricky. We found within that 1 mile distance span, if you're more concerned about air, odor, and noise, you reported on average, I think it was 2.9 more symptoms than if you lived further than 2 miles away. So we asked ourselves, what is the reason for that, or the potential reason? And the potential reason is possible bias, like we mentioned. People are just very angry about oil and gas. Or it could be that not feeling well makes you look at your surroundings and say, what's going on? And you may be more aware of your environmental concerns around you. I think in general, people are concerned about air quality in Colorado because, we see ozone alerts all the time from the state, and, people have a big awareness of air quality, not necessarily related to oil and gas. And then we looked at the respondents that were least concerned about air, odor, and noise, and we saw the inverse. They reported less symptoms. And this could also be due to a bias that people are pro oil and gas and they're like, I'm not reporting symptoms. Nope. And if I have symptoms, they're not related to this. So bias always goes both ways. And in the end, sometimes it's sort of a wash, like, okay, there's for and there's against. Or we could say that people that are least likely to report concerns are also less aware of environmental issues because they're not experiencing health impacts. So those are the unknowns, and we're very open and transparent about, yes, there's unknowns and there is potential for bias. But when you go back to and that was a small sample size because not everybody reported they were extremely concerned or not concerned at all about air, odor, and noise. So we were looking at a small sample size. But when we looked at our sampling overall, we continued to see these, and no matter how we adjusted for confounders, we continued to see these increase in the reporting of symptoms within that 1 mile from the pad for upper respiratory and acute health symptoms. So, no study is perfect, but this is the best we've got. And a lot of epidemiological studies work like this. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. That's very helpful. I appreciate your thoughts on that. And I apologize if I missed this in the presentation anywhere. Is this the only air quality monitoring program that Broomfield has set up, programmatically targeted at oil and gas? Is there other air quality monitoring that you're doing associated with other industry or construction or anything like that? Or is this the entirety of what you're focused on air quality wise at this time?
It's the entirety of what we're doing with air quality, oil and
Gotcha.
gas.
Presumably that's a result of the complaints. I saw the complaint slide that started the program.
Really, it was the project itself, the 6 unconventional pads that sparked interest, and then investment into a complaint and response system plus the air quality monitoring program.
Gotcha. Thank you, Mr. Valdez. I appreciate that. And do you use this data that you've derived from the survey in other planning, or, as far as the utilization of the data, simply oil and gas related as well? I can expand on that if that's a little vague.
Yes, please. Could you expand on that?
Thanks. What I mean to say is that if you do have areas that you believe are air quality wise a concern right now, does the city and county use that data to potentially limit other possible emitters in those types of areas, or simply uses it to focus on oil and gas development?
Well, I could say that the system was designed to just look at oil and gas development. So we're not seeing, we have some monitors that are away from oil and gas so that we can take a look at what background levels look like. And we're not seeing, any other influences in those areas away from oil and gas that, raise concern that there could be another polluting industry. But I will say that we're not trying to target any other industries either. We're just simply looking at oil and gas emissions.
Sure. Okay, thank you. And then Mr. Valdez, I think this question is directed to you. I think I heard that we talked about the concern as far as emitters, and maybe to Dr. Weisner as well. But it sounded to me, what I inferred from your discussion was really the largest concern is during pre-production. That's when we believe the largest potential emissions are going on.
That's fair, yes.
And thank you. And then I think I also heard you say that once the gas wells are in production, was one of the reasons that the city and county allows residential development up to a 250-foot setback because they're in production and arguably the emissions are quite a bit lower. Is that correct as well?
The distinction that we made there was sort of the old vertical wells versus kind of multi-well pads. So our 2,000-foot setback still applies to multi-well pads, whatever phase of production that they're in, whether in pre-production or production. The old vertical wells that are kind of one-offs and that are all in production already in Broomfield, those are the ones that have the 250-foot reciprocal setback.
Got you. So as far as the city and county is concerned, if they're a multi-well pad, you don't permit any kind of development within 2,000 feet currently.
That's right.
Gotcha. And then on this proposed pad, my understanding was that there isn't currently residential development within 2,000 feet, but there is scheduled or planned or anticipated residential development within 2,000 feet, but not 250 feet, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. All right, thank you. I appreciate that. Again, I appreciate the testimony and all of your hard work on this issue. Those are my questions for now, Mr. Chair. Thanks.
Great questions from commissioners. Do we have others? All right, I am not seeing other questions from commissioners at this time. So I think next we have the response presentation by Crestone. Ms. Larson, if you could visualize yourself, and or Ms. Jost. Ms. Jost, let me ask you a leading question. Would it be preferable to you and your clients for us to take an early break for lunch and give you some time to get ready, or are you ready to go now? And do you think you'll take a long time, or what's your ideas?
Yes, thank you for asking, Chair. Yes, we would very much appreciate an early lunch break so we can prepare our rebuttal to the direct as well as the rebuttal testimony that was presented from Broomfield. I think I would say that if you have the typical lunch break of about 45 minutes to an hour, that would be adequate time for us to prepare, maybe leaning towards the hour.
What if we do 50 minutes and return at 12:30? Would that be?
That sounds wonderful.
Good. Then let's take a lunch break. It is 11:41. Let's return at 12:31. That's 50 minutes. And we will hear from Crestone and then the remainder of the hearing.
Great. Thank you, Chair.